Every neighborhood had one. The self-appointed guardian, the unofficial inspector, the person who somehow knew who received packages, who forgot to bring their trash cans in on time, and who had visitors staying longer than 3 days. In Maple Ridge Estates, that person was Karen Whitmore. Nobody had elected her. Nobody had asked for her help. Yet somehow she had spent the last 7 years acting as though she owned the entire subdivision. Karen lived in a large 2-story brick house near the front entrance of the neighborhood. From her front window, she maintained what many residents jokingly referred to as the surveillance station. Every morning began the same way. Coffee in hand, curtains slightly parted, eyes scanning the street for anything that seemed out of place. A moving truck, a contractor's van, a visitor parked too long, a lawn that hadn't been mowed recently. Nothing escaped her attention. The Homeowners Association had repeatedly reminded residents that Karen was not an HOA board member, despite how often she spoke as though she were. But facts rarely stopped Karen from inserting herself into situations that had nothing to do with her. Over the years, she had accumulated a reputation that stretched across every cul-de-sac and side street in Maple Ridge. She reported children's lemonade stands for lacking permits. She complained about holiday decorations remaining up 2 days beyond HOA guidelines. She photographed parked vehicles and emailed lengthy complaints to management. Most people learned that arguing with Karen only encouraged her. Ignoring her worked better, usually. The trouble began when House 47 sold. The property sat at the end of Willow Creek Lane, tucked behind mature oak trees that partially concealed it from the road. It was one of the largest homes in the neighborhood, but also one of the most private. For nearly 6 months, the house had remained vacant after the previous owners relocated across the country. Karen had taken a special interest in the empty property. She frequently walked past it. She monitored contractor visits. She made several calls to real estate agents, seeking information about potential buyers. Nobody gave her any answers. That only increased her curiosity. Then one Tuesday morning, a moving truck appeared. Karen noticed it within minutes. A dark pickup truck arrived first. A second vehicle followed shortly afterward. Then movers began carrying furniture into the house. By noon, Karen had already posted questions in multiple neighborhood social media groups, asking whether anyone knew the identity of the new owners. No one responded with useful information. The new resident appeared determined to keep a low profile. The moving process continued quietly over the next several days. No housewarming party. No introductions, no social media announcements, no effort to meet neighbors. To Karen, this was suspicious. People who had nothing to hide introduced themselves. At least that was her belief. Instead, the new homeowner seemed content to remain invisible. Lights came on at night, vehicles came and went, but otherwise, very little activity could be observed. Naturally, Karen became obsessed. She began taking her evening walks past the property more frequently. Then she started taking morning walks as well. Soon she was making 3 separate passes each day. Every visit left her increasingly frustrated. The privacy fence surrounding the backyard prevented observation. The garage door remained closed. The blinds stayed drawn. The homeowner offered no opportunities for inspection. Weeks passed. Karen's curiosity transformed into irritation. Irritation evolved into entitlement, and entitlement slowly developed into something much more dangerous. One Saturday morning, she spotted a landscaping crew working on the property. 3 workers unloaded shrubs and decorative stone near the driveway. Karen immediately marched across the street. The workers politely ignored her questions. They focused on their tasks and continued working. That response infuriated her. She interpreted their refusal to engage as disrespect. Within hours, she had convinced herself that something improper was happening at House 47. Perhaps unauthorized construction, perhaps code violations, perhaps illegal rentals. Her imagination supplied endless possibilities. None of them were supported by evidence. But evidence was rarely required when Karen decided she was right. Over the next month, she began compiling what she called a documentation file. Photographs, notes, vehicle descriptions, dates and times, pages and pages of observations regarding a neighbor she had never actually met. Meanwhile, the homeowner remained blissfully unaware. The man living at House 47 maintained a predictable routine. He left early most mornings, returned late evenings, kept his property immaculate, never played loud music, never hosted disruptive gatherings, never violated a single HOA regulation. Ironically, he was probably the least problematic resident in the entire neighborhood. But because he stayed private, Karen viewed him as suspicious. One afternoon, she watched a package delivery driver leave a large box on the front porch. The package remained untouched for several hours. Karen became fascinated. She drove past twice, walked by once, then parked near the corner to observe from a distance. The homeowner didn't return until after sunset. By then, Karen had spent nearly 4 hours monitoring a cardboard box. The absurdity of the situation never occurred to her. Instead, she felt justified, important, necessary. The neighborhood, she believed, depended on vigilant people like her. As summer approached, temperatures climbed. Residents spent more time outdoors. Barbecues and pool parties became common. Neighbors socialized. Children played in front yards. Yet House 47 remained quiet. The homeowner rarely participated. Karen interpreted his absence as arrogance. Others simply assumed he preferred privacy. Then came the incident that changed everything. It started with something trivial. A contractor accidentally left a side gate partially open after performing maintenance work. The gate remained unlatched for less than 2 hours. Most people would never have noticed. Karen noticed immediately. While walking past the property that afternoon, she spotted the slightly open gate and slowed her pace. She glanced toward the backyard, then glanced again. No vehicles sat in the driveway. No activity appeared inside the home. The property seemed empty. Karen stopped walking. For several moments, she stood motionless on the sidewalk. A dangerous thought entered her mind, one she should have dismissed instantly. Instead, she entertained it. The gate was open. The homeowner wasn't home. And after months of unanswered questions, an opportunity had finally presented itself. She looked up and down the street. No one appeared nearby. The neighborhood was unusually quiet. Karen stepped closer to the property, then closer still. Her heart raced, not from fear, but from excitement. The kind of excitement that comes when someone convinces themselves they are about to uncover something important. She told herself she was protecting the community. She told herself she was investigating potential concerns. She told herself many things. What she never admitted was the truth. She was about to trespass simply because she believed normal rules did not apply to her. Karen reached the gate and placed her hand on the latch. For a brief moment, she hesitated. One final chance to walk away. One final opportunity to mind her own business. Instead, she pushed the gate open and stepped onto private property. She had no idea that her every movement was being recorded. She had no idea that multiple security cameras were tracking her progress. And she certainly had no idea that the homeowner she had spent months obsessing over was not an ordinary resident. Because at that very moment, several miles away, the owner of House 47 was finishing an important meeting at the county sheriff's office. And before the day was over, Karen's curiosity would lead her far beyond the backyard, and directly into a mistake she could never take back. Karen stepped through the open gate with the confidence of someone who had spent years convincing herself that curiosity was a public service. The backyard of House 47 was far less exciting than she had imagined. For months, she had built elaborate theories about the mysterious homeowner. She had pictured hidden construction projects, unauthorized additions, neglected maintenance issues, or perhaps some secret activity that would justify all the suspicion she had carefully nurtured. Instead, she found a perfectly maintained yard. Fresh landscaping lined the fence. New stone pathways curved through neatly arranged flower beds. The grass was trimmed with professional precision. Everything appeared orderly, clean, and remarkably normal. Karen stood motionless for several seconds. The sight disappointed her. She had expected evidence. Instead, she found responsibility. For a brief moment, she considered leaving. A reasonable person would have done exactly that. After all, she had already crossed a line by entering private property. The lack of anything suspicious should have ended the matter immediately. But Karen's problem was never a lack of information. It was an unwillingness to accept information that contradicted her assumptions. If the backyard revealed nothing unusual, then perhaps she simply hadn't looked hard enough. She began walking deeper into the property. Every step felt easier than the last. The first violation had been crossing the gate. Everything afterward became increasingly simple. That was how entitlement often worked. Once a person convinced themselves they deserved an exception, Each additional boundary seemed smaller than the one before it. Karen slowly circled the backyard. She examined landscaping equipment stored beside a shed. She inspected newly planted shrubs. She peeked through screened windows. She even made notes on her phone. To Karen, this wasn't trespassing. This was research. The distinction existed only in her mind. Meanwhile, several security cameras mounted around the property quietly documented everything. Every path she followed, every window she approached, every attempt to peer into spaces that were clearly none of her business. The recording system captured it all in high definition. Eventually, Karen reached the rear patio. A large, sliding glass door connected the outdoor space to the house. The blinds were partially open. Through the glass, she could see part of the living room. Her curiosity intensified. The interior looked surprisingly elegant. Tasteful furniture, framed photographs, bookshelves. Nothing unusual. Nothing alarming, nothing that remotely justified her behavior. Yet instead of accepting reality, Karen searched harder. She moved closer to the glass, then closer still. Pressing near the door, she attempted to get a better view of the room beyond. That was when she noticed something unexpected. The sliding door wasn't fully closed. It sat slightly ajar. Perhaps only an inch, maybe less. Most people would immediately recognize this as a sign to leave. Karen interpreted it differently. To her, it felt like an invitation. Not an actual invitation, of course. No one had welcomed her. No one had given permission. But entitlement has a remarkable ability to transform opportunities into perceived rights. A small opening became justification. A private home became accessible. A clear boundary became merely a suggestion. Karen glanced around the backyard. Still no witnesses. Still no homeowner. Still no consequences. Her confidence grew. She convinced herself she was conducting a harmless inspection. Perhaps she would only look inside briefly, just a few moments, just enough to satisfy her questions. Then she could leave. Nobody would ever know. The rationalizations came easily. They always did. Karen placed a hand against the door and gently pushed. The opening widened. Air-conditioned air drifted outward. For a moment, she hesitated again. Not because she believed what she was doing was wrong, but because even she understood that stepping into someone else's house crossed an entirely different line. The backyard was one thing, the home itself was another. A person could still pretend they were investigating from outside. Inside the house, that excuse became much harder to maintain. Karen stood at the threshold. One step separated curiosity from outright intrusion. One step separated speculation from criminal behavior. One step separated a neighborhood nuisance from something much more serious. And then she took it. She entered the house. The silence inside felt almost unsettling. Sunlight filtered through large windows, illuminating polished hardwood floors and carefully arranged furniture. The home reflected discipline and order. Nothing appeared out of place. Nothing suggested wrongdoing. The more Karen saw, the less justification existed for her presence. Yet she continued. Room after room, she wandered through the house. The living room, the dining area, the kitchen. Each space revealed another disappointment. The homeowner seemed normal, responsible, organized. Karen found herself becoming increasingly frustrated. She wanted to discover something, anything, some detail that would validate months of suspicion. Instead, every observation undermined her theories. Then she noticed a hallway leading toward a home office. Unlike the other rooms, the office door stood partially open. Karen approached carefully. The room beyond looked professional. Bookshelves lined the walls. Awards and certificates hung in framed displays. A large desk occupied the center of the room. Several photographs sat nearby. Karen entered. This room, she believed, might finally provide answers. She began examining the contents. The bookshelves contained legal texts, leadership manuals, and public administration references. The framed certificates appeared official. She leaned closer. The first document carried a county seal. The second displayed commendations. The third referenced law enforcement training. Karen frowned. Law enforcement. That didn't fit any of her assumptions. She moved closer to another wall. Several framed photographs showed the homeowner participating in community events. In one image, he stood beside uniformed officers. In another, he appeared at a public ceremony. Karen felt confusion replacing confidence. Something about the room suddenly felt different. Then her eyes landed on a large framed photograph positioned prominently behind the desk. She stared, looked away, then looked again. The image showed the homeowner wearing a sheriff's uniform, not standing beside a sheriff, Not visiting a sheriff, actually wearing the uniform. The official insignia was clearly visible. The accompanying plaque identified him unmistakably. County Sheriff. Karen's stomach dropped. The realization arrived all at once. The mysterious homeowner wasn't hiding from the community. He wasn't avoiding neighbors. He wasn't operating some secret project. He wasn't violating regulations. He wasn't suspicious at all. He was the county sheriff, the highest-ranking law enforcement officer in the area, and Karen was currently standing inside his house without permission. For the first time that afternoon, genuine panic appeared. She suddenly became aware of every decision she had made. The gate, the backyard, the windows, the door, the office, the photographs. The fact that security cameras almost certainly existed. The fact that every movement might already be recorded. The fact that she had entered the home of a man whose entire career revolved around enforcing laws. A cold sensation spread through her chest. She needed to leave. Immediately, Karen turned toward the doorway. Her earlier confidence had vanished completely. Now she wanted only distance. Distance from the house. Distance from the evidence. Distance from the consequences she suddenly realized might be very real. She hurried down the hallway. The front entrance was only moments away. If she left now, perhaps nothing would happen. Perhaps no one had seen her. Perhaps the cameras weren't recording. Perhaps a sound interrupted her thoughts. The unmistakable noise of a vehicle entering the driveway. Karen froze. Karen froze. The garage door motor began humming. Heavy tires rolled across concrete. An engine shut off. Then silence. Absolute silence. The kind that feels much louder when someone is trapped by their own choices. Karen stood motionless in the center of the hallway. Her heart pounded. Her breathing quickened. And outside, just beyond the garage wall, the homeowner had arrived home far earlier than expected. What Karen didn't know was that he had already received a security alert on his phone 20 minutes earlier. He had already watched portions of the footage, and he had already recognized the woman wandering through his property. Now, as footsteps echoed from the garage entrance into the house, Karen realized she wasn't trying to avoid being caught anymore. She was about to come face to face with the very person whose home she had illegally entered. And the sheriff was no longer watching through a camera. He was walking directly toward her. Stood frozen in the hallway. The sound of footsteps moved steadily through the garage entrance and into the house. Every possible excuse she had rehearsed over the years suddenly felt useless. For someone who had spent countless hours questioning other people's actions, she had never seriously considered what she would say if she were ever forced to explain her own. The footsteps grew closer, calm, measured, unhurried. Whoever was approaching wasn't rushing because he already knew exactly what was happening. That realization made Karen's anxiety even worse. A moment later, the homeowner appeared at the end of the hallway. He stopped immediately. His expression remained remarkably controlled. There was no shouting, no visible anger, no dramatic reaction. In many ways, that made the situation more intimidating. The man simply looked at the stranger standing inside his home. Then he looked at the hallway around her, then back at her again. The silence stretched. Karen felt her confidence evaporate completely. For months, she had imagined herself investigating a suspicious neighbor. Now she understood how ridiculous that assumption had been. The homeowner wasn't confused. He wasn't surprised. And most importantly, he wasn't asking what she was doing there. He already knew. The security system had answered that question long before he arrived. Karen suddenly became aware of how impossible her situation was. The cameras had recorded her entering the backyard. The cameras had recorded her approaching the house. The cameras had almost certainly recorded her stepping through the door. There was no misunderstanding to clear up. No missing information. No alternative explanation. Reality existed in high-definition video. The sheriff calmly walked toward the living room. Karen remained where she was. Her mind raced through excuses, but everyone sounded absurd before she could even consider using it. The truth was painfully simple. She had entered private property without permission. Then she had entered a private residence without permission. There was no version of events that made her look reasonable. The sheriff's composure never changed. Years in law enforcement had exposed him to people caught in far worse situations. He understood something Karen was only beginning to learn. Most serious mistakes begin with small acts of entitlement. People rarely wake up intending to create major problems. Instead, they convince themselves that rules don't apply to them in one particular circumstance. Then another. Then another. Eventually, they arrive somewhere they never expected. Karen had started with curiosity. Now she stood inside a stranger's house, facing consequences she had never imagined. The sheriff retrieved his phone. A few touches on the screen brought up the security footage. Multiple camera angles appeared. The recording showed Karen entering through the side gate. Another clip showed her moving through the backyard. Another showed her examining windows. Then came footage of her entering the house. The evidence was comprehensive, painfully comprehensive. Karen stared at the screen. Watching her own actions from an outside perspective felt entirely different. The behavior she had justified moments earlier suddenly looked exactly as it was. Intrusive, unreasonable, unlawful. For the first time, she saw herself the way everyone else likely did. Not as a protector of the neighborhood, not as a concerned resident, not as a vigilant observer, simply as someone who had crossed boundaries that never belonged to her. The sheriff listened quietly as Karen attempted to explain herself. Her explanations became increasingly weak. What had sounded logical inside her own head now seemed impossible to defend. Concern for the neighborhood, curiosity about the property, questions about the homeowner. None of it justified entering someone else's home. The more she spoke, the more obvious that became. Eventually, even she seemed to recognize it. The sheriff remained professional throughout. That professionalism somehow made the situation feel even more serious. There was no personal argument, no emotional confrontation, just facts. Facts supported by evidence, facts supported by recordings, facts that couldn't be disputed. Within a short time, additional deputies arrived, not because the situation was dangerous, because procedure required documentation. The responding officers treated Karen respectfully, but they also treated the situation seriously. A homeowner had reported an unauthorized person inside his residence. That wasn't a neighborhood disagreement. That wasn't an HOA complaint. That wasn't gossip. It was an actual legal matter. As the deputies reviewed the footage, Karen's embarrassment deepened. The reality of the situation had become unavoidable. Months of obsessive attention toward a stranger had culminated in one disastrous decision, and now multiple law enforcement officers were watching recordings of her wandering through a house that wasn't hers. News travels quickly in neighborhoods. It travels even faster when the neighborhood already has a well-known busybody. By the following day, residents throughout Maple Ridge Estates had heard some version of the story. The details varied. The conclusion did not. Karen had entered a neighbor's home without permission. The neighbor happened to be the county sheriff. For years, many residents had tolerated her behavior because confronting her seemed exhausting. Now the situation had changed. People began discussing experiences they had previously ignored. Unwanted photographs, excessive monitoring, boundary violations, repeated interference in private matters. A pattern emerged, one that had existed for years, but had never received serious attention. Karen's reputation, carefully constructed through endless self-appointed authority, collapsed almost overnight. Meanwhile, the sheriff returned to his normal life. He had never sought attention. He had never hidden who he was. He simply preferred privacy. Ironically, the entire situation could have been avoided if Karen had done something remarkably simple. Nothing. If she had minded her own business, no conflict would have existed. No embarrassment, no investigation, no consequences. The mystery she spent months trying to solve wasn't a mystery at all. It was merely a private citizen living quietly in his own home. Several weeks later, House 47 remained exactly as it had always been. Well-maintained, peaceful, private. The difference was that people now respected those boundaries. Residents waved when they saw the sheriff around the neighborhood. Some even apologized for the unnecessary attention his property had received. He accepted the gestures politely and moved on. Life gradually returned to normal. For Karen, however, things never fully returned to the way they had been. The authority she once imagined she possessed disappeared. Neighbors became less receptive to her opinions. People stopped treating her assumptions as facts. The reputation she had spent years building had been undone by a single afternoon. Not because of bad luck, not because of a misunderstanding, because of a choice. A choice that began with an open gate. A choice that continued through a backyard. A choice that crossed the threshold of a house she had no right to enter. In the end, the lesson was surprisingly simple. Privacy is not suspicious. Boundaries are not invitations. And the rules that apply to everyone else apply equally to the person who believes they should be exempt from them. Karen spent years acting as though she could investigate anyone she wanted. The day she finally picked the wrong house, she discovered something she should have learned long before. The most dangerous assumption a person can make is believing there will never be consequences. Because sometimes the homeowner isn't just another neighbor. Sometimes the homeowner is the county sheriff.